Hello, I'm Andre J, and today I'm going to talk to you about Temporal Vortex. So Temporal Vortex is the newest addition to the VSER Pi family, Video Synthesis Ecosphere Raspberry Pi, the family of synthesizers which includes Wave Pool, Spectral Mesh, Artificial Life, Chromatic Aberration, The Search for Sasquatch, Super Heckle Adventures 64, Auto Wave, and there might be something else. I don't know, I should write these things down. But yeah, so what Temporal Vortex does is slit scan video. What slit scan video means is it's an abstraction of the slit scan photography technique, which is so slit scan photography is literally there's a little slit that scans over the lens when you take a photo, and this means that different parts of the frame represent different moments of time. So this is something you can do mechanically at home. You could make your own slit scan out of any sort of camera where you can leave a shutter open, and I would invite people to play with this kind of stuff because it's a lot of fun. It's fun to build sort of like these physical recreations of this kind of stuff. But as you can see, this isn't a still, this is a video. So what the slit scan video is doing is you can see this little oscillator, grayscale oscillator thing that pops up here. And what you're seeing here is what the Temporal Vortex looks like and does the moment you boot it on. And I'm using a USB camera for this that I have right next to the camera on my laptop that I'm recording this on. So you can sort of see a combination of how long the time delay is and what it's doing to like essentially the same video that's coming in. So it's updating. We split up this video into like a set of distinct zones, and the grayscale oscillator, temporal, the time oscillator over there, is using the grayscale values to say, I'm going to grab video from how many seconds ago. The total buffer for this is, I think, maybe like 16 seconds or so. I forget exactly. I've done the math a couple of times and I keep messing it up, and it just reminds me why I'm not a professional mathematician. I'm a professional video wizard because I'm sloppy at the math. You can get away with a lot of slop as video wizards because it's mostly just magic, not math. That's a mild joke. Magic and mathematics are the same thing. But we're using the grayscale values of that sort of say where this time is. So if I turn the amplitude down completely, then it's just going to grab instantaneous video. Pretty instantaneous. There's a tiny bit of latency when we're using the USB camera, but you can see, compared to the latency of the laptop, it's pretty small. But as I bring up the amplitude of these oscillators, it might be amplitude which is so small it's kind of hard to even see, but it does start to sort of warp through time. If I amp it up all the way, then we're going to get this really crazy thing going on. But yeah, so first off, the first part of this video, I'm going to just use this setup and use this setup to sort of talk about all of the basic functionality of this. And then later on in the video, we're going to process some video feedback, the same way I did in the Wave Pool video, which you should check out as well. And then I will process artificial life through this, same thing as I did in the Wave Pool video, because I like to have fun, and this stuff is fun. But yeah, so functionality. If you're familiar with video oscillators and how video oscillators work, this will all be a little bit sort of whatevs, but I think it'll still be interesting to see how video oscillators, we can use video oscillators not as sort of source material, but as like FX triggers. It's like in your audio synthesizers, we have LFOs that are just devoted to doing sort of like control changes over things. Like we set an LFO on the filter. It's not audible. Like the LFO itself isn't audible. It's below low frequency oscillator means it's below audible range. So if we just plugged the LFO into a speaker, you wouldn't hear it. If you plug it into the cutoff of your filter, you get a filter sweep, and next thing you know, you're making trance music. I need to remember not to laugh so much during these because it always fucking clips out on my laugh. laugh. So I need to figure out, or I need to like step back if I'm going to laugh. Remind me to step back if I laugh. You can't actually respond to this because that's how video works. But yeah, so low frequency oscillator on your filter sweep. You can't hear the oscillator itself, but you can hear what it's doing to the parameter. And we think about that's sort of the same way that I'm using video oscillators in this. It's also the same way I'm using video oscillators in spectral mesh. Where we use these sort of hidden video oscillators, it'll pop up in a little corner of the screen by default, but we can turn it off at any point. But I think it'll be really helpful to leave this on for the most of this video, because having this visual sort of like guide to how time is being displaced helps out a lot. So we can use the oscillator, instead of generating video, we're using it to manipulate video. Specifically, we're using it to look in this giant buffer of video and try to find a point for every pixel that represents the time that we want to grab from. So if I do things like start it scrolling, this is the rate control, and we can have it go fast and scrub through time all crazy. And we can slow it down a bit. There's also a button for just freezing it, because sometimes you find a nice little grayscale pattern. You don't want it to be moving all over the place, you just want to hold it there. So we have freeze on, and then you can turn the freeze off. We can control the frequency. We can control the amplitude. So you see that more amplitude means more time displacement. So if you're sort of, you don't want this sort of crazy all over the place time distortion. Oh, oops, I have motion recording on because I was playing with that earlier. Whoops, let me turn that off. But yeah, we can use amplitude to sort of dial in how much time we want to be warping through and how much resolution, how much temporal resolution for each oscillator. Because there's two oscillators. Well, there's already one for them. And then there's going to be another control that we can use for temporal resolution too, the combined output of the temporal resolution, but I won't get to that until number 6 on my notes list here. Other things we can do with these oscillators is I can change the orientation of the oscillator. So it'll start out, your basic oscillator will go like this, and then as I move the orientation, then we get this vertical thing. So a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with this kind of thing from like Instagram filters and stuff. You freeze the oscillator. Alright, let me get the oscillator to a point that I want it to, and then freeze it. And then you've probably seen something like this before in like Instagram filters or TikTok. Is TikTok have filters? I'm old. I don't know these things. But you see this kind of thing where like as I move around, my body turns into like a bunch of noodles and I'm falling into a black hole. Pretty awesome stuff. Yeah, the different orientations allow for sort of different time gradients. And of course, when we get into motion recording, you'll see that we can automate this process to have a sort of shifting back and forth, and that gets pretty nifty. We have different wave shapes as well. So the default wave shape is a triangle, and I selected triangle as default instead of sine because the sort of linearity of triangle looks better for scrubbing through the time buffer than the non-linearity of the sine. The curves, because of how quantized the processing on this is, and the internal processing on this is kind of crazy. Like, honestly, like, most of my other video synths are using, like, reasonably, like, state-of-the-art, modern, GPU enhanced, parallel processing things to do what they do with such, like, low latency and immediality. I didn't really have the option to do that with this, just because of the nature of how, like, the GL works. The actual functionality of this, I think you could pretty much write this in pure C. Pure C, which is a language that was developed in, what, the late 60s, early 70s? So theoretically, you could run this on, like, friggin' x86 or something, old school PC from the 90s. As long as it had enough RAM, which it probably would not have enough RAM. But the programming on this is really, it's a mixture of like really well done and incredibly hacky nonsense. But the end goal is that we get this. So, you know, you do what you can. You do what you can with what you have. So we have different wave shapes. We've got triangle, and then I can do a saw. And we won't really be able to see the saw too much unless I turn off the freeze and we start things moving up. Now you can see what a saw wave looks like. It's got that sharp cutoff and then it goes down like that. Maybe it's a ramp. I don't know. That stuff starts to get pretty abstract once you're doing this kind of stuff with it. And then we have square wave. Square wave is neat because it allows you to sort of like slice up time in these really discrete batches. And I'll show you a little bit later once we get into Oscillator 2. But this kind of stuff, pretty friggin' rad. And you notice that as I move the amplitude, so the black of the oscillator is always going to be pretty much right now. But the brightness of the oscillator we can sort of scrub through, so we get different things going on. And we also have noise. We've got some nice, smooth noise going on. So if you've ever wanted to have a smooth noise time oscillator, then you are in luck, because this is the only thing I know of that you can do real-time smooth noise time oscillation with. Is that a sentence that is even worth saying? What a ridiculous thing. But wait, that's not all. In addition to control over wave shapes, we also have different wave patterns we can do. I'm going to go back to the default wave shape and see that we have radial patterns you can select as well. So we can do this sort of bubbling sphere thing coming in and out. We can do this, which is sort of like, it's not actually a hyperbola. It looks like hyperbolic, but it is actually just 4-quadrant parabolic, which is a little bit of a different curve. But I really wanted to include, like, I really wanted to have some kind of like hyperbolic oscillator at some point, but I'm going to have to like do better math than I did for this one to get pure hyperbolic, because I've had some pretty awesome like hallucination, like trip zones with like hyperbolic thing visuals happening, and I feel like that's something that has to enter into my video synth zone at some point or another. So stay tuned for hyperbolic oscillators. We can also control the wave shapes on these. So if I go into, there we got the saw. Is that the saw? No, it was the square. There's the saw. So these radial oscillators can all have the same wave shapes, except if you do noise, it just turns off the radialness. Try to figure out some other ways to combine those in the future. And then we also have this sort of like, this shape. I forget what I do to actually make this shape, but I wanted to have one other sort of like radial oscillating thing. So here we are, and I like the curves on it. So it's like an eye. It's maybe like a sideways eye. It looks like some other things too, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to mention that in this video. But yeah, so that's basically our oscillator set. But wait, that's not all. I have 2 time oscillators on here, and we can combine these in some interesting ways. So let me bring up the amplitude on oscillator number 2. So we've got, turn off oscillator 1, turn up oscillator 2. Add some frequency. You just freeze this up for a moment too. We've got oscillator 2 and oscillator 1. So you can see as we combine them like this, then we get this combination of things going on. You turn the freeze back off, you get a little bit of movement happening. Whoop. And then something interesting that happens when you start to combine these oscillators, and oscillator 2 has all the same features as oscillator 1. It just like defaults to a different orientation. That's the only difference, really. And I have a bunch of different switches that allow you to do sort of crazy things with how you combine the oscillators. oscillators. So let me just go through these switches. I'm not going to explain exactly what they're doing because it's probably boring to everyone, but for each one of them, it's pretty nifty still. So these things are basically, once you sort of like overflow, because we're adding two oscillators together, and you think of them as having ranges from like 0 to 1. We add two together, we're going to have a range from 0 to 2. And I decided as we go over each one, we should have slightly different ways to like handle like how we combine them, and then we can get like a larger variety of like shapes and distortions available to us. So let me turn this one on radial too, because it's pretty interesting to see the radial and non-radial oscillators interacting with one another. So this is one distortion mode. Here's another distortion mode. Oh yeah, the first one is just a simple wrap. This one is fold over. You can see if I don't amp up the oscillators enough, we don't really get that folding over thing. We just get a weird shape combination. And here's another one. I think some of these do like some kind of crazy FM stuff. You can see it gets pretty wild and distorted pretty quickly. And at this point you might say, well, this just looks like mud. This isn't what I was going for. I don't want the mud video synth. Well, there's another little control on here that allows you to control the total temporal resolution of your combined output. So at this point, when I have these and I say I want something a little smoother, I'll go over to my total temporal resolution and turn that down a bit. And then we get something that has got a little bit more clarity to it. It's still pretty wild. You can fine tune it a bit. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Here's another distortion mode. Pretty wild. Yeah. And another distortion mode. Yeah, let's hit the reset switch. Now we're back at 0. And I'm going to show you something you'll notice on this. The internal processing is also at 320 by 240, which seems like a low resolution. It was like the default resolution for like gaming systems up until like I think PlayStation 2 or maybe the Sega one of that era was like the first one to have like 480i as like an output. So I think 240p is like a pretty awesome resolution to work with and looks a lot better than anyone would think. But it will still end up, because of the nature of how this works and how everything is processed in here, it will get a little bit, what do you call it? It can get a little quantized at times. So I have a blur built into this. So you can add some blur into things, and we'll see some really nifty things we can do with the blur once we start adding feedback into everything. But for now, we can just use the blur to kind of smooth out some of the crispy edges you get. Then we also have the ability to use these time oscillators to grab R, G, and B values from different parts in time. And if that doesn't make sense to you, I will just show you what I mean. So I'm going to turn up red offset. So you can see what's happening is that there's just like a red shadow that is like displaced at slightly different times than everything else. And we can do the same thing with green and blue. And I'll show you a little bit more wild stuff we can do with like different inputs, but see if I set this other oscillator to square. Let me get this going on here. Let's set them just to add together normally. I want 2 square oscillators, and I want to make a grid pattern. So I'm going to set them both here, set them both for their defaults. Squares? No, that's 2 squares. There we go. I was doing it with saw waves. I need to practice my instruments more. And you can try different ways of combining them to get different sort of like of these crazy discrete things coming out. Something to take note of, and we'll see this later, is that there's sort of remarkably different effects that this has if you're using So the main way that I've seen people use video slit scan, sort of like the default method that people are doing, is it's one person with a background that does not change, and just the person is changing. And this is kind of like the cliche. If you look at that Zbigniew, the fourth dimension video, it does a bit more with like, it's pretty much all exclusively moving figure, even if it's like a non-human figure in the foreground and a still background. And this works really well, but the fact that we have this to play with now, the Zbigniew like fourth dimension thing took months to make because people were physically editing like film, like cutting it up and pasting it together. But we can do this as a real-time instrument now. Did I show you this already? This is what it looks like. People always want to know what these things look like, and I'm always just like, oh yeah, is physical reality that important to people? I'm more of just like, my thing is always just like, what can it do? But I need to realize that people are interested in like the physical implementations of things too, and prioritize that. But yeah, so default way to use this is sort of moving thing in the foreground and then still background. We can show you how to do sort of different compositional things with this in a non-traditional manner. And I'm very excited to see what kind of stuff people get up with this. Definitely let me know on Instagram, like tag me and Temporal Vortex with the underscore in it and your stuff, so I can see what people are getting up to. What was I going to say? I think that just about sums it up for the basic functionality. There's one more thing in here, which is a bit experimental at the moment, but I'm hoping that people can play test this, let me know how it goes, and we can sort of bake it, get a little more like, it's a little half-baked right now, but it'll get more fully baked as we proceed. We have a freeze function. So what I can do is, using two knobs, I can set sort of beginning freeze and end freeze. And let me just make sure this works. I'm going to step off camera. You see that it's sort of, I might need to have like a gradient thing going on so we can see more of what's happening. But you can see what's going on is that I've chosen a slice of the video that it's just going to freeze and loop through. So believe it or not, what we have is, this is actually a very crude kind of like video looper sampler thing. And it's not really the way anyone would expect a video looper or sample, and I don't know if anybody ever expected a video looper or sampler out of me, but we kind of have one right now. So you just basically use the two knobs to kind of like scrub through and select which portion of your buffer you want to have be looped. I'm back. Let's see how long it takes me to show up in the video. There I am. So that's about how long the buffer is. The moment from me stepping back on and me actually showing up all wiggly wobbly in the video. But I think that about sums up the basic functionality. And then next we will talk about, so I'm going to use the analog capture to give some video feedback inside, and then we'll talk about using motion recording on this and how we can use motion recording to automate and sequence our temporal vortex. Alright, and we're back. We've got some full color feedback going in through the temporal vortex. So you can see I've just got this set to default mode. I didn't have to power down and power it back up to set it up with the analog capture device. But once we have this running with the analog capture device, I can actually hot swap sources. So I can pull it out. It'll take about 30 seconds for it to register that I fully pulled it out or something. And then plug it back in. I don't really have another source at hand, but if I did, we could do that instead. And then we would be able to plug in my VHS and we could watch Fifth Element through this, which I should probably do sometime. That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I'm just going to kind of like maybe not talk so much and just goof around with the video for a second and just sort of show you what kind of crazy abstract fluid liquidity we can get from doing time oscillation. And this is, I haven't even like touched the controls. They're just at the default state when they turn on. And this is what you can do. pretty crazy stuff. There's a lot of green in the feedback, so there ended up being a lot of green in here. Try to get some more color going on. Add some more color in everything. Whoops. Glitch video. A little bit more color going on. You see, but you'll notice when playing around with this, at least for me, when I play around with this, I notice that doing things slower does better stuff than faster. But, you know, I also just don't really like stroby stuff in general. Well, that's not exactly true. I don't like quick cuts all over the place. I'm pretty okay with stroby stuff. But we can set basically the quick cut kind of thing on this can do some pretty insane things. I'm just going to pull the resolution down a bit so you can see what's going on a bit better. I'm going to start to oscillate this oscillator. Let's move the rate up a bit. And so we've got motion recording on here. Motion recording means when I hit the motion recording on, which I'm going to do right now, that everything I do on the controller gets recorded and looped. I'm going to change amplitude, pull this up, and pull amplitude down. Up and down. And it's an 8-second buffer. I'm going to do frequency down and up. Down and up. So there's really a lot you can do. And I'm going to adjust the axis a bit too. So I'll move the axis up, and then I'll move the axis down. Alright. Now we have this motion recording thing set. I'm going to do some more wacky stuff. Oh yeah, now that we've got this going on, I can do a little bit of this R, G, and B distortion. I'm trying to give it some really minimal stuff to play with so you can really see what's going on with all this RGB distortion biz. This is pretty freaking crazy. Let me just show you what this looks like. I'm going to turn off motion recording, reset the controls, and turn down the amplitude. You can just see what's happening on the screen on its own. Let me try. Let's do this spherical oscillator thing. So you can see it goes back and forth in time too, because of how these oscillators work. Especially if you're using the triangle wave shape, it's going to go back and forth in time. So you get this sort of scrubbing forwards and backwards. Wow. I really haven't had a chance to explore this too much, and I hope I get to have a little vacation this holiday season just to focus on this stuff. Not that I don't enjoy making these videos and talking about them with everyone, but it's fun just to like sit and zone out on this kind of thing by myself for hours, or with a friend too. Wacky. Let me try a different wave shape. This is the saw wave shape, a spherical oscillator. Oh yeah, something I also wanted to try. Let me do motion recording back on, and I'm just going to play around. I want to try to very slightly and subtly play around with the amplitude. And this will do something interesting, I think, in terms of like time displacement, like moving things back and forth. Let me see if it worked out. A little weird. Not quite what I was doing. I need to practice at this a lot more. Hee Turn on the square wave. Let's increase the frequency a bit too. I didn't think square wave would be that interesting to me, but it kind of turns out to be one of my favorite things to do with this thing. It's just this really discrete, chunky time oscillation. Turn on oscillator number 2 too, so we get a little bit of a gradient happening as well. Okay, totally zoning out here. We'll move on to one more thing I wanted to do was let me get in an internal feedback loop on the MX30 I'm working with here. Wild times. Let's see how it works. So mostly what we have been working with so far is this kind of figure on a dark background, a dark unchanging background. But now with this, so I'll show you what's coming in. It's a pretty classic internal feedback patch on the MX30, using the Vitamate to like do some detailing and stuff. But this is definitely not one object on a fixed background. So this will kind of show you what else we can do with this. This is what happens when you feed it something that's just sort of like all over the place like this. Do a little bit of RGB displacement. Just do a tiny bit so we get sort of a chromatic aberration effect. If you think about it, when you're using this kind of a temporal displacement with the temporal vortex, you're really able to jam out with yourself in the past. You can do something and then 30 seconds later have that be integrated into your live feed, which is kind of a weird and interesting and creative, unique creative zone to be in. You can hang out with your past self. Haven't you always wanted to jam out with your temporally displaced consciousness? Maybe not. Maybe that's a weird thing to say. Some things moving here. Try some different wave shapes. Noise. ways of combining the oscillators. Oh, that's pretty wild. So you notice that using these different distortion buttons, the overflow buttons, you can get these sort of, what do you call it? You can turn a continuous wave shape into a discontinuous wave shape, which is nice for these sharp edges that allow you to sort of distinctly slice between time. But yeah, that about sums up this portion, but stay tuned because what we're going to do next is I'm going to turn on the old artificial life and get that one involved in here. Maybe not quite next. This is a really nice setup. I just kind of want to like show you what we got going on here. So this is the input right now. This is pretty nifty. I like the subtlety of this. Fun subtle blobs. Alright, for real, it's artificial lifetime. Alright? Alright, now here we are with artificial life into Temporal Vortex. If it seems like I'm pushing artificial life in these promo videos, it's because I am. I think it's a really awesome and interesting and unique tool, and I would like more people to explore it and find fun stuff to do with it. The thing about artificial life is that it's an oscillator-based video synthesizer, and you can kind of think of it, I know not everyone is going to be familiar with it, but you can think of it as being similar to the Vidiot in that it has the ability to take video in and use that to displace oscillators, and it's got kind of a colorizer. It's got an RGB colorizer going on in it, but what makes artificial life really unique is it is set up for oscillator signal feedback paths. And this is something which is actually not remarkably easy or cheap to do with analog video oscillators. So even if you're like, oh, this is a digital piece of shit, I just use analog stuff, I'd invite you to look into it and give it a chance, because I'm not really trying to make stuff that like replaces analog gear. The goal of my synthesizers is not to be analog emulation. The goal of my synthesizers is to say, what can we do with this digital processing that is unique to digital processing and uses that to its utmost extreme awesomeness. And I think artificial life is a pretty great example of that. So first off, I'm going to set up a fun little patch with artificial life. So it's running through Temporal Vortex right now, but I have no time oscillation, so it's really just passing through a life at the moment. So I want to try to set up something that recreates a little bit of that still image on like unchanging background. Let's see if I can do something similar to that. I can do radialization of the oscillator, and it's not symmetrical. I could probably make it symmetrical, but I kind of like the asymmetricality of it. I'll explore it. I'll talk about the asymmetricality of it more when I do the artificial life focused one, which will be next. But what I think is neat about the asymmetricality is that it gives this interesting sense of space. It makes it slightly easier for me to like do this kind of thing where you can morph in and out of linearity and radiality. And yeah, it's also just easier to do. I was lazy when I got to that part of the code, and I was just like, this works. I'll try to fix it later. And you can see I did it fine in Temporal Vortex, so obviously I can do it. I just have weird priorities, I guess. But yeah, you can do signal-based feedback in a number of ways in artificial life. So I'm going to set up Oscillator 2 and do some phase mod from Oscillator 2. So, got that going on there. Set up Oscillator 2 to be radial as well. And then, let's turn up the feedback. There we go. We can also do a little bit of internal feedback. We can use the output video from each oscillator to phase mod the internal video. So we got a couple of different layers of internal feedback happening here. Awesome. Turn up the contrast a bit so we get a little bit more space going on. And then we add just a little bit of color going on. We turn on motion sequencing. Yeah, like I said, the motion sequencing, motion recording, it's in beta. Not as smooth as it could be. Full disclosure. Let me add some color modulation into here. Oh, that's a little much. Let's do tiny color modulation. Tiny color. Now let's start to play around with a temporal vortex and see what we can do with this as an input. Turn on the motion recording in temporal vortex. Pretty loud stuff. Use the spherical oscillator to warp the non-spherical input thing. Turn up the blur a little bit. Some RGB distortion. Alright, so that's just a little taste of what you can do when you feed artificial life in the temporal vortex. And I forgot, but it's not too late. Next, I'm going to show you a video feedback pass-through loop through the temporal vortex so we can see what happens when we do time-displaced feedback. Alright, and here we are. I set up a feedback loop with temporal vortex in it. So what I've got is the setup I was using before. We have a Sony camera, Panasonic MX30, and a Vitamate video processor. The output of that is going into temporal vortex via the analog capture, and then the output the Temporal Vortex. We're actually going through one more step. I'm recording this, I'm using a V4EX to record this and upscale it and convert to progressive so I don't have to deal with interlacing. And then the output is going for that. So there's actually a little bit more latency than there would be otherwise because of the V4EX involved. So just full disclosure, there's a lot of latency, but it's slightly less latency than this. But it's worth it for me to be able to record this like I'm doing right now. Yeah, so I'm actually not doing any of the temporal vortex stuff on it right now. This is just as is. So this is what the processing is sort of adding to everything. This is always fun to do. People get a huge kick out of this. There's always, when I post something like this where I'm like moving my hand around and it's like interacting with the video, people are just like, whoa, shit, is that Touch Designer or something? And I'm like, yo, I don't know about Touch Designer. There's too much mouse clicking in that. It's ergonomically rough on my body. I just do this with the camera. It's a lot easier. I can loosen up my shoulders and just use my hands to do things instead of like clicking all over the place. You know, that's the worst thing about computers is mice clicking all over the place. If you can do everything with the little keystrokes and macros, then you're like golden. Or you can just use your hand gestures to do things and just do this camera feedback stuff. That's even better. Alright. Let me start doing some oscillations. Amplitude up. So now you can see as I wiggle my hand in front of the screen, we got some time dilation happening here. Hi! And without further ado, I'm going to hop in here and start messing around with the camera a bit. Because it's so slow, or not so slow, but because it takes so long to like get from like the buffer, because it's like, what, 16 seconds? Is that what I said? Maybe it's 30 seconds? You know, I don't know if it's obvious to y'all, but I prepare so poorly for these things. I'm always doing this off the top of my head, which means like I probably say wrong shit all the time, which is, it's a good thing that I'm demoing these things, and mostly I'm just talking about literally what my hands are doing, so that helps me not be saying wrong things. But let me get back to you on like the exact time length. I think it's like 2 hours. I think it's like a 2-hour buffer. It's like 16 seconds. But anything I do to the camera, it's going to take a while to catch up. So if I just try to do really slow, crazy movements and start to zoom in a bit, see it's going to take a bit of time for things to really catch up. If I was going to set this same thing up again, I'd give myself a little way to see what the camera was doing better. Maybe I'll just erase this. Nah, I'll just keep going with what I got here. I like to do things first take only. But yeah, it's a nice study in like complexity to like see what you can do with in these really weird circumstances. Because what I'm doing on the camera doesn't kind of like register until like 16 to 30 seconds or 2 hours later. Try some more oscillator shapes. Let me turn on spherical. Let me get some rotation, or not some rotation, let me get some oscillation happening. Whoa. People sometimes tell me I should try to do like VR or like AR stuff, I'm just like, are you sure? I feel like if this stuff, if the stuff I made was like filling your field of vision and like taking over, this might be like mildly like horrifying and or like severely like difficult to process as a human being. I feel like it would make people like nauseous and fall over, perhaps like severe brain damage. It's not to say that I'm not going to like try to work with that at some point in my future, but I'm going to say that be forewarned whenever I do get into like the virtual reality stuff. Like, watch out. It could be dangerous. And turn off the camera. Turn on some internal feedback and see what happens with the internal feedback on the MX50. As expected, pretty crazy so far. Try a different oscillator. Allow for everything to catch up. Put my hand back in there so I can kind of see what's going on. I'm putting my hand on the screen right now. It's been there for like several seconds. We can do a count and just see how long it takes. There's my flesh. You got some Andre flesh going on in there. Try a different wave shape. I'm going back and forth from the camera feedback to the internal feedback. And with the square wave going on, we're getting some pretty nifty stuff. Oh yeah, that's what that was. I had a little bit of the downstream key going on. That's why all that stuff was going on. Alright, this is a bit more of what I was trying to get at originally, is I just wanted to do some pure camera feedback with this. But as usual, I set things up kind of goofy. Let me turn off the little oscillator in the corner. And then, we're going to do something else. Yeah, I'll try this instead. Oh yeah, let me try noise. Smooth noise. I was trying to figure out how to give the smooth noise some of that square wave crisp edges. I'll get there probably in the next update or so. But you've never seen camera feedback look like this before. If you have, let me know. I want to know about how you got camera feedback looking like this, because I am pretty psyched with this. Honestly, I never tried this before. This is the first time I'm trying this. Next time I do this, I'm going to set it up so it's easier for me to rotate the camera. I used a camera using a hot tripod, which is pretty handy for going like up and down. A little wonky for doing rotations. You can do a couple interesting things with this, but rotating not so well. I've also inverted the camera feed, you may notice. Turning the invert off, see how long it takes everything to catch up. These are some kind of like mildly barfy colors. Freeze. It's zoomed in really hard right now. What you're seeing is phosphor pixels. And I lost the feed, so should probably use that as a reason to say we're about done with this stage of things. I keep forgetting how does zooming in and zooming out work. Okay, that's zoomed out, I think. Yeah, it's really confusing. Maybe I'm done. Maybe I'm not. Yeah, it looks like I'm not done. Oscillator unfreeze. Alright, I think I'm done with this. Alright, well, thanks a bunch for sticking with me. Thanks for your interest in Temporal Vortex. Definitely let me know what you would like to see in terms of future tutorials, information on this, information on my other synthesizers. I'm going to be in the process of doing one of these videos for each one of my synths before the New Year's. So if you let me know in YouTube comments or Instagram, my Instagram account, or Scanlines XYZ, or the Facebook Video Waves group, then we can work together and come up with some useful stuff for everybody. But as always, have fun and bye!